Good morning, everyone. I know people are very eager to learn Spanish, but I will teach you one Maragoli word. That's my first language, and how we greet. And when I say the word, you will just repeat the same way I say it. Let us try. Mirembe. Mirembe. That's how we greet in my language, and that's my first language. It's called Maragoli. And Mirembe means peace. And in my country, the western part of the country, they call it the Mrembe Nation, the peaceful people. That's where the majority of Quakers are in the country. Before I dive into the preaching today, I will say it's a joy to have children in our service today. And can we just clap to welcome children in our service today? And I have to do this with caution that I'm not taking Philip's job. And I'll begin my sermon by asking you to do this thing for me. Ask the person who is sitting next to you, who do you say I am? Ask the person who is sitting next to you, who do you say that I am? Thank you for doing that. Another question. Thank you. Another question that I want you to ask is, what scary truth do you resist hearing? What scary truth do you resist hearing? In the Gospel according to Mark chapter 8, verse 27 to 38, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If you want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. What a powerful set of readings. Maybe even breathtaking, particularly if one thinks about how it might have been for Jesus' disciples to hear his words. Mark describes these interactions beginning while Jesus and his disciples were walking together, perhaps along the road, or maybe across the fields. He began by asking, "Who do people say that I am?" And the group reported various things that they had and likely that they were thinking too. But then this next question was addressed particularly to them. But who do you say I am? Jesus' query was akin to the words of George Fox, Jesus' query was akin of the words of George Fox, which he said, "You will say, Christ says this, and the apostles say this, but what canst thou say? Art thou a child of light and hast walked in the light, and what thou speakest, is it inwardly from God?" Jesus was not content to stop at hearing the disciples' reports about other people's conjectures, but wanted to know what they were thinking, how they understood him. The passage doesn't record how various disciples might have answered, or even if they did, it moves straight to Peter's response. "You are the Messiah." This word Messiah has a long roots in Jewish understanding. It means the anointed one. This refers to the ritual which included placing or pouring olive oil on the head of someone to bless that person for a particular kind of leadership, particularly a king or a high priest, and perhaps even a prophet. This designated a leader as legitimate, someone called by God and confirmed through the ceremony of anointing. The term Messiah was often used in reference to King David, and then later in light of understanding that there would always be a king of David's lineage on the throne. That ended when Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians in the 16th century BC. And the hopes of the Jewish people turned towards a future king. They would recognize the Messiah because he would come in glory, a king with power and might. He would be sent by God to free the people from oppressive rule of the Roman Empire and whatever proxy had been placed over them by the Romans. In Jesus' time, that was Herod Antipas. As described in the New Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, the cognitive dissonance caused by the discrepancy between the divine promise and the present reality is the root of the messianic expectation. Jesus' question, "But who do you say that I am?" was not just for the disciples. It is a question for us each to answer. If you are growing and seeking new understanding in your faith journey, that answer will change over time. Some of the ways I respond include, "You are my teacher. You are my friend. You are the light. You are the living water." I treasure C.S. Lewis' description of Aslan, the lion who is the Christ figure in his children's series, The Chronicles of Narnia, he's not safe, but he is good. That is particularly fitting for this passage. To return to the passage from Mark, can you imagine the shock and dismay of the disciples when, after Peter identified him as the Messiah, Jesus went on to describe what they should expect: his rejection by the religious leaders, suffering, death, and rising from death. It was such a shock that Peter responded in indignation, grabbing Jesus, yanking him away from others, shouting his rejection of this news. In other words, in the words of one of the sources, clearly Peter attached significance to the title Messiah that excluded suffering. The word translated as rebuke is a very strong term, like yelling, "Shut up." Jesus' response to Peter was similarly strong. It included his referring to Peter as Satan, the being working in opposition to God. One commentator suggests that Jesus was not equating Peter with Satan, but pushing back at the temptation that may have come through Peter's words. An inner thought: you do not have to go through this, there can be a different way. But Jesus was determined to remain faithful to God's, even knowing that it would bring about vengeance by the authorities, as had happened to John the Baptist. Peter's rebuke could not be allowed to stand as a distraction or temptation away from the paths of faithfulness. Jesus speaking this very, very hard foretelling of what lay ahead for him, and Peter's reaction may have its parallel for us with difficult things that we are told or come to understand. Like Peter, we want to resist the painful truth about things which bind us spiritually. We need to be willing to hear and to take in a really unwelcome truth when God is calling us into deeper form of faithfulness. This leads to the second question: what scary or disorienting truth do you resist hearing? As I sit with this query, the response that comes to me is embodied in a song from a musical South Pacific. It's a recording, and I didn't organize for it to be played, but I keep learning more about how people come to believe that those who, like me, are identified as black are inferior to people identified as brown, white, or by other racialized terms. Jesus is challenging me to let go of the myth that being formed as racist depends on being taught explicit and overt prejudice while growing up. Jesus calls me to acknowledge the painful truth that the insidious reach of implicit bias and systematic tribalism, racism, sexism, and all other isms has shaped how we see ourselves and our worth as people. He calls us to name and resist the internalized messages that devaluate our identity and to reclaim the truth of our dignity, belovedness, and full humanity. In the passage that we read, in Mark 8, 34-38, Jesus went beyond talking about his own future persecution and death to talk about the potential for those who followed him also to get in deep trouble and even be killed for their faithfulness. That's hard word to be told, and even can know that those who first heard Mark's words were experiencing that kind of persecution themselves. This is not about holding up suffering as a goal. As one commentator noted, suffering that results from the ways that God's kingdom does not comport with human dominion is very different from prescribing suffering for its own sake. And another, fidelity to Jesus brings persecution because the disciples live in an age that is contrary to God. We who are here today are privileged not to face that kind of danger that was present for the early Christian communities. We hear of people in this time and age who do face persecution, imprisonment, and even death for their beliefs, but we certainly hope never to be tested in that way. But the teaching to die in order to live spiritually is not limited to actual physical life and death. In the ordinary events of our lives, the challenge to be willing to die is more likely to be about things of the spirit, our hearts and our allegiances, than about the physical suffering and death faced by Jesus and his disciples. Needing to lose your life in order to save it, and the warning that in trying to save it you will lose it, challenges us to pay attention to that which needs to die in us, or to that to which we need to die, so to be faithful. When faithfulness calls us into some form of suffering, following that will lead to being spiritually alive rather than resisting it and spiritually perishing. I want to affirm that Jesus did not mean to put up with abusive things that are harming us. When he talked about dying to self, he meant dying to things that are keeping us from becoming the fullness of what God is calling us to be. It can be necessary for the growth that God is calling us to do. And the final question is, what is God calling you to die for faithfulness to flourish within you? What rises in me in response to this question is the call to release the weight of internalized narratives that have tried to shape how I see myself and my worth as a person, and as a person of color, as a person from one of the smallest tribes in the country where I come from, as a person who has traveled a very difficult journey to be where I am. And yes, when I arrived here, this country, the conversations about racism, the conversations about classes, the conversations about the rich and poor in this country, the conversations about Republicans and Democrats, in all these conversations and all these interactions, it means letting go of the belief that our intentions alone are enough. When someone names that I have caused harm, I am called not to retreat into defensiveness or self-protection, but to listen with humility and take responsibility. Even when my intentions are good, they do not erase the impact. They do not undo the hurt that may have been caused. I am learning to move beyond the need to prove myself as good, and instead to remain open to growth, accountability, and transformation, trusting that God is present in that process. And this is my wish, even to our leaders, church leaders, political leaders, all leaders around the globe today. We are being called to resist the illusions that have not been shaped or wounded by the old isms, be it tribalism, be it racism, sexism, and to recognize how these forces have affected our identity, our community, and our way of being in the world. We are being called to honor our dignity while also being responsible for the impact of what we say and what we do. We are being called to name and resist systems that elevate some while diminishing others, and to refuse acceptance of injustice as normal. We must not take lightly the strength, the voice, and the urgency we carry, but instead use them with intention and courage. We are being called to interrupt the status quo by speaking the truth, recognize how dishonest beliefs operate, and committing ourselves to healing, to justice, and revelation for ourselves and for others. As we enter into time of worship, friends, I leave you with these three questions. The question from Jesus, who do you say that I am? The question, what scary truth do you resist hearing? And the question, to what is Jesus calling you to die in order to be a more faithful follower?